Bill Dodge was a very bad man, a man the caliber of which folks in the Deep South still like to talk about when they mention Reconstruction. This was a man that, after the Civil War had ended, continued using slavery under a different name, the convict leasing program, or the peonage system. He was born in Connecticut and raised among the elite upper crust of New York, where he styled himself an abolitionist. He gave speeches, and in front of crowds of cheering wealthy people said that slavery was morally wrong and must be abolished wherever it was not economically profitable. But if you could make a handsome profit, society just needed to adapt to its use. And after the Civil War had ended, he was contacted by his friend in New Hampshire, a man named Eastman, who told him that there were 300,000 acres in the middle of the state that were just ripe for the taking right down here in Georgia. So Dodge decided to draft up some papers that said he owned 300,000 acres of pine forests, land that was prime for the export of wood and for turpentine. This was some of the roughest work imaginable after the Civil War, and he was now telling hundreds of families that their land was his land, and any deeds they showed that differed from his opinion were simply fraudulent. This was something that killed dozens of people. As they tried to fight back, the police, which had been bought out by the Dodge Corporation, would kill them and say they were reaching for something. It was a war that lasted from the end of the Civil War up until the Great Depression, when the last of the lawsuits had finally come to an end. And the house here behind me is what really sparked off the powder keg of the war, because he built this home in order to house the elite property manager of the corporation, John Chisholm Forsyth, a man who came from Canada to manage the property holdings. And supposedly, according to locals and newspapers, he was reading the paper in front of his wife and child when someone pushed the barrel of a shotgun through the window and took his life, running into the woods and back to their cabin. Now, who this was is to this day a mystery, but you can bet that the Dodge Corporation had a list of people they wished to blame.
When I was growing up, there was two houses there. There's only one now. I don't know what happened to the other one.
It seems like a lot of the locals still know that the Dodge Corporation was very evil around here.
Yeah.
What are some of the things you've heard about them? I mean, a lot of people were killed.
Bankers, weren't they?
Up from New York, yeah.
From New York.
And this is the kind of abandoned railroad town that you'll find all across the Deep South. It is the sign of the times economically. This was mostly active during the Dodge War days, back when they had gobbled up all the land here in Dodge County. And this is actually just 2 minutes down the road from where John Chisholm Forsyth was assassinated. Dodge County was the epicenter for the land troubles, and the Dodge Company was invited by another northern industrialist named William Eastman, who saw how rich the resources of this poor part of the state was. The county seat was named after him, and unlike Dodge himself, Eastman had the common decency to actually live on Georgia's soil. He died in New Hampshire, but wanted to be buried here in the town that bore his name. He also commissioned a beautiful Italianate Victorian home that now holds the county's historic society, and you can see that right here. Until 1896, this town was called Normandale, after Norman Dodge, the son of Anson Dodge. The Dodge family were self-styled Yankee aristocracy, invited by New Hampshire businessman, a man named Eastman. The county seat was named after Eastman, and until the community here dwindled and changed its name to Suomi to honor Finnish lumber workers, it was named after the company owner's son, the only man to ever actually take up the reins of leadership and move to Georgia. He's still buried here to this day. About 50 people died over 44 years of that conflict. By the time the trials were all sorted, it was the Great Depression, and the Dodge lands were barren, so it didn't really matter anymore. Behind me is the grave of John Chisholm Forsyth. He was assassinated on October 7th, 1890 in the Dodge land troubles. Now, folks called him Captain John because he was an Englishman who served in the Canadian military, but after serving there, he went to work for the Dodge Land and Lumber Corporation. He was a fixer and a doer, and his house in Nelsonville, which was a very well-defended, pretty much fortified company town, sat right across the way from the house where business executives and property dealers would meet. It was right off the side of the railroad. And on October 7th, 1890, somebody supposedly tiptoed up to his window while he was in his reclining chair, sitting in front of his wife and children, pushed a shotgun through the window, and killed him, running off into the woods. Papers immediately reported the story that a local man named A.J. Renew was responsible. These papers claimed that company man and Deputy Sheriff Ed McRae brought out bloodhounds and began a county-wide search for this A.J. Renew. However, although he would die in a shootout the day after the assassination of John Chisholm Forsyth, the papers would also make this entire fiasco a footnote, bringing in lawyers, people who opposed the company, and also just sidelining any story about the one of dozens of people who were being killed left and right over these land battles that was mostly the product of the dirty dealings of the Dodge Land and Lumber Corporation. And this is the cemetery of the New Red Hill Holiness Baptist Church in Milan, Georgia. Captain Forsyth had been assassinated on the 7th of October, 1890. The following day, Ed McRae organized a search with bloodhounds and hundreds of Dodge Company employees. They pursued A.J. Renew from Normandale to Telfair County, just over the county line. The papers initially claimed that there was no argument that Renew had killed the company officer. Footprints practically led back to Renew's cabin, at least so claimed the papers, and when the posse called out to him, supposedly Renew shouted back, "You're the man I want." He was then shot down, reaching for his gun in front of his wife and children. The graves we just visited, one of them was your grandma. And it was her mother who...
Yeah, it was my mama's mom was there, and it was her mother. It was her daddy that got killed by the sheriff.
Could you tell me a little bit about how that killing happened?
No, what I can remember, the professor down there in Statesboro told us was that the sheriff and his posse went out to their house, but he wasn't there. And he, while they were there, he came walking out of the woods and walked up there to where the posse was, and the sheriff shot him and killed him. And his wife went and knelt down over him, and the sheriff got off his horse and walked over there and put his knee in her back, pulled back on her, and messed up her back. But she was 8 months pregnant, but the baby was born, which would turn out to be my grandmother, or my mama's mom.
And speaking of his children, although Renew's grave might be unmarked, his daughter Anna went on to marry John Bennett Williams, the son of John Daniel Williams, the sheriff of Telfair County from 1906 to 1933, when he was suddenly killed pretty mysteriously, although the papers say it was meningitis. And it looks like Sheriff John Williams actually is buried in this cemetery. He is close to the road, and his stepdaughter and son are buried right over here, just before the Davis grave. This couple is buried next to their father and stepfather, and although the Telfair sheriff has no marked grave, his father, Anna's step-grandpa, was a Confederate veteran. The Williams clan and the sheriffs of Telfair County were righteously pissed off at the Dodge Corporation and viewed them as cowardly carpetbaggers, and only done, at least by their reckoning, to end one farmer who obstinately opposed eviction and was related to the sheriff. It was a message to the citizens of Telfair County. It's an unusual grave in the same cemetery, the silent arm of Ben Self. And A.J. Renew's daughter, Anna, married John Bennett Williams, who's buried right there. I would suspect, because grave records indicate that A.J. Renew is buried in this cemetery, that he's probably buried somewhere in this plot. And over here is the beautiful New Red Hill Holiness Baptist Church. Behind me is the grave of Lucius Williams, who, like A.J. Renew, was also a Confederate veteran. And like A.J. Renew, the company saw a huge threat in him and had him killed. Now, this was because they had put out an eviction order and said that all of the deeds to his land were false. Lucius, or Old Luce, he said, that's not true. And I'm 60 years old, you know that I'm not going to forge these documents. They said, well, a lawyer says that they've been forged, so you have to leave your land. And Old Luce says, I just won't. What are you going to do about it? So they send in a U.S. Marshal named John Kelly, who's working on the company's dollar, and John Kelly brings along his two friends, the Garrison brothers. How do you think they arrest this elderly Confederate veteran? Do you think that they knock on his door and tell him there's a warrant out? No, they walk inside, and while he's asleep, hold a shotgun up to his face, and John Kelly pulls the trigger, blowing his face off. And immediately, the two Garrison brothers begin to fill him with lead from their revolvers, and they take in his two children, who are alongside him, who they said were causing a bit of problem. Now, they also tried to depict this in papers as Old Luce being a bad man. They called him the sort of leader of all the squatters in Dodge's land. And they said that even his own father-in-law had taken out warrants against him because he was such a bad man. But there's one problem with that. His father-in-law died 3 years before the company killed him. Now, as near as I can tell from these old newspaper clippings, it seems like John Kelly was able to hide behind his badge because he was a U.S. Marshal, and he took the first train out of Telfair County, where this murder was committed, going back up to the little Dodge Kingdom up there in Eastman. But the sheriff of Telfair County took personal offense to this because it was an action that happened on his watch in his jurisdiction. So he went out and arrested the Garrison brothers. Now, of course, this made it up to federal court, and it was revealed that they'd been deputized, but the details of the killing were pretty egregious. However, as soon as the case landed on the desk of Judge Spear in Macon, who was personal friends with the Dodge family, he was his own little Southern aristocrat, it just evaporated, and nobody was ever really brought to justice for the killing of Old Luce. And it's important that I point out that sheriff of Telfair County was a bit of a thorn in the side. After all, he did arrest those two Garrison brothers, even though the company assured him they'd been deputized and the killing was all done nice and legal. Well, he died of a sudden fit of, I believe, some sort of meningitis, and his son married the daughter of A.J. Renew, the man who was killed several years before they killed Old Luce in a similar manner. And you can probably pick up on what I'm suggesting. The sheriff of Telfair goes against the corporation and dies mysteriously of a very sudden illness with no proof he wasn't poisoned. And that sheriff's son marries the daughter of A.J. Renew, a Confederate veteran who was also killed by company men. It seems like the Telfair County authorities, at least on some level, wanted to hinder the corporation and their war against people who lived there all their lives. And for all the Dodge Corporation's efforts to paint the Williams family as some podunk hillbilly squatters, you can see their monuments in this cemetery are some of the nicest around. So it was obvious that they were deeply entrenched with local affairs, local politics, and they presented a real threat to the corporation's grip on power. Behind me is the grave of D.S. Williams, a very proud Confederate veteran, someone who lived on land that couldn't be farmed in the remote Pine Barrens. He saw the Dodge Corporation come in and literally take up this land, writing their own fraudulent deeds and claiming that the deeds to the land that had been in these families for generations were forged by a series of corrupt local lawyers. Williams saw his own friends, in many cases other Confederate veterans, swept up by corrupt cops and company cops owned by the Dodge Corporation and put back to work essentially as slaves using the convict lease program. And and D.S. Williams's son saw that his father, a man who deserved respect as a veteran, was being given none. And seeing this, he ran for the sheriff of Telfair County. Well, it was that man's son, John, who married Anna, the daughter of A.J. Renew, who's very important to this story because, naturally, Renew was killed by the posse after the Dodge Corporation's main land agent, Forsyth, was killed in his own home. So you can see that these families kept together and tried to fight the corporation as best they could. That sheriff's son, John, married Anna, the daughter of A.J. Renew, who was accused of assaulting and killing company agent John Forsyth. The sheriff and his family didn't believe it, and neither did most independent journalists who paid attention to that assassination, or the poor farmers of central Georgia. That sheriff, this Confederate veteran's son, fought the Dodge Company whenever he could, and died suddenly and was given no headstone. But this is as good a place to tell the story of some carpetbaggers as any other on southern soil. Company-owned papers were given a line. They were to downplay or ignore the killing of Renew, whom they had insisted was responsible, citing but never actually giving any evidence. Their new line was that a group of about 8 men hired a mysterious outlaw from North Carolina named Rich Lowry to assassinate Forsyth, and that Rich had escaped. In fact, less than a month after Forsyth's killing, papers reported this killer, supposedly Lowry, had escaped with the mark of Cain upon his brow, a reference to the fact that the Lumbee tribe of the Carolinas is Lowry, and the mark of Cain, back in those days, meant they were darker skinned. With Lowry, a dark-skinned man and half Indian on the run, they figured the company would be able to arrest anyone who opposed them. Looking back on it, there might not even have been a Rich Lowry. It was just a smokescreen made to disguise the company's dealings with killing people who would oppose them. They blamed someone who was a little darker skinned and hoped that the locals would simply believe it. Next to me is the grave of Henry Brown, and it says right here, was murdered by John A. Harrell and Daniel Harrell, January 15th, 1872. This is a prime example of some of the earlier troubles in the Dodge Land War. Both the Harrell and Brown families knew that the Dodge Land Corporation was moving in and buying up all the properties, and the Harrells viewed themselves as a bit more upper crust than the Browns. And when John and his son Dan came over to confront Brown, they decided to pull out a revolver and shoot him. Now, this is one of several incidents that involved these two families, and back in the day, when you put something like this on your tombstone, that was a message not only to your children, but to your children's children as well. They wanted this story told, but sadly, in Georgia's history books, it just isn't really talked about. That's what I'm trying to do here today. The Brown family also maintains that they hired a lawyer from Macon, Georgia, to take up the case several years later. He arrived by train, took $500, and was never heard from again. Now, nothing else really came of this case, but whether this was a huckster who took the family's money, back then $500 was quite the sum that is not adjusted for inflation, or whether it's the case of the Dodge Corporation silencing a legal mind, we'll probably never know. I should also point out that Henry Brown's brother Asa was killed 2 years after he was shot by the Harrell family. There's no grave photo on Find a Grave, but I figured I would include the newspaper clipping that was in that bio. It says, a fatal difficulty occurred in Dodge County in the vicinity of station number 12, now Chauncey, on Thursday, 24th instant, resulting in the death of Asa Brown. It seems like Brown had been suspected by some of his neighbors of taking other people's sheep. Whether he was guilty or not, we are not prepared to say. At any rate, this led to the difficulty. On Thursday, he killed 2 sheep and 3 of his neighbors, Elvin Yawn, his brother, James Wesley Yawn, and a man named English, Ephraim English, went over to Brown's and asked for the heads of the slaughtered sheep. Brown produced one of the heads, but refused to show the other. A fight ensued in which all parties participated. Brown seized a pole and knocked down one of the Yawns, and also English. One of the men, Elvin Yawn, stabbed Brown in 2 places, on the arm and under the arm, from which wounds he died. I also want to point out that later in 1877, Elvin Yawn pled guilty to manslaughter. Wesley Yawn and Ephraim English were found not guilty by the court system there. This is one of the sons of the man who killed Henry Brown. He's supposedly a general, but seems to have been more of that in the capacity of a sort of state militia. He's buried just outside of the downtown part of Eastman, the diplomatic center of the Dodge lands. Seems like if you lived here, you were either transiting through for the company or doing some sort of company work. I can't figure out why he died at the young age of 32, or maybe it was a murder, but in 1888, he was listed as the captain of the governor's guards in this city. He was also the leader of a council of North Carolina teachers. Now, what's interesting is the governor's guards in this city makes it seem like it's a sort of paramilitary. Now, that's all the way back in 1888. A paramilitary in the Dodge lands. And on Brown's tombstone, it says that he was killed by John Harrell and son Daniel. Now, this is John Daniel Harrell, or J.D. Harrell, and his father. These were the two men who showed up over the land dispute. Another one of the Harrell sons is over here, a local community member, sort of a prominent citizen, rather, up in Eastman. And right behind them is a plot for the Brown family. So this wasn't necessarily a Hatfield and McCoy family feud, but it was a very brutal fight over land rights and honor, which has always been a big thing in the Deep South. And just behind the plot where the Harriets are buried, you've got George Cadwell, who died pretty young. I wonder if his death had anything to do with the land troubles. One of the first men that the Dodge Land and Lumber Corporation accused of assassinating their agent, John Forsyth, was the lawyer, Luther Hall. They based this off of the fact that he was ruling against the rights of Norman Dodge. In reality, he was just helping his clients who lived in the county, which, according to the Dodge Corporation, was all his personal county, and the land that surrounded it as well. Now, these papers, when announcing the victorious arrest of this lawyer in broad daylight as he ate breakfast, also mentioned in passing that a county official named Wright was also arrested. This was the sheriff of Dodge County, someone who the Dodge family felt hadn't really been helpful enough to them, so they took him in as well. After Hall was arrested, in quick succession, authorities also brought in a couple of his friends. That included Dodge County Sheriff Wright Lancaster and his friend Lem Birch. Now, they aren't buried in this cemetery, but I just wanted to point out how corrupt this was. The papers almost stopped mentioning the killing of Renew, who initially they claim was seen killing Agent Forsyth, and they started to claim, well, it actually wasn't him. You can tell that this was directed by a northerner. It was actually a mulatto man named Rich Lowry, but no one's seen him. Go hunt for him. So they're fanning through the swamps, but most people locally know that this is just officials from the Dodge Corporation trying to get them to go on a wild goose chase for anybody who might be a little darker skinned living in the swamps. It's despicable what this corporation did to the people here in the central Georgia counties. And I just want to make one last note before I leave this cemetery, that the papers here kept insisting they had foolproof evidence on the fact that these men were conspiring with that Lowry man in order to kill the agent of the corporation. They kept saying they had this evidence, but they never presented it. They just kept saying, trust us, it's irrefutable. And because they had conspired with this mysterious assassin that no one could find, they were just as guilty as the one who pulled the trigger, so it was the duty of the people of Georgia to sentence these men to death. This is a corporation that is totally complicit in paying off authorities, in befriending prosecutors, trying to kill 8 people who were defending the rights of families who had lived on this land for generations. I haven't been able to find the grave of Sheriff Wright Lancaster, who was the sheriff of Dodge County, but this is his family's plot Quite a few Lancasters are buried here in the back of the cemetery, and the story is very interesting because naturally they killed Renew, the company, and then stopped talking about the death of Renew in order to arrest a couple of lawyers. And after arresting Luther Hall, they claimed that one of Hall's conspirators wrapped up Wright Lancaster in with his conspiracy. So naturally, they ordered the arrest of the sheriff of the county, as well as his brother John. Now there is a John Lancaster buried here, but it's not the same one. But you can also see a Henry Lancaster buried here, who died pretty young. He was born in the 1890s and died in 1930. I wonder if it has anything to do with it. And I should correct myself a little bit. He was born in 1901 and died 1931. Henry Cleve Lancaster, but John Jason Lancaster was born in 1899 and died in 1925. And that's such a cool name on the right, Jesse James Cobb. In my father's house, there are many mansions. He died very young. I wonder if there's a story there. And not really much to do with the war here in Dodge County, but William H. Stuckey, of course I'll leave this coin, but it's the Special Weapons and Tactics, the SWAT team here in Smyrna. He's with the police department. I'll have to kind of look up his story. William Stuckey. All these towns look pretty much
Turn
dead.
right onto 1st Street, then turn left onto Georgia 117 South.
They have Dean's Playhouse.
Turn left onto Georgia 117 South, Central Street. Continue on Georgia 117 South for 13 miles.
And back into the Pine Barrens. The Dodge family was very famously Presbyterian, but the only member of that family that was Episcopal was Anson Dodge Sr.'s son, Reverend Anson Jr. Now, Reverend Anson Jr. actually seemed to take a liking to Georgia and its people, and he married his first cousin, Ellen Ada Phelps Dodge, who took on the surname Dodge, and they moved into the local area. And the Atlanta Constitution actually said, "No man has done more to further the cause of Christianity than he." Anson Jr.'s first wife, Ellen Dodge, would pass away on a tour of India in 1883, and as a method of grieving, he decided to construct this church right here behind me and become a reverend. Now, this is especially important because this church was said to have been built on the foundations of the really beginnings of Methodism here in the New World. Actually, they said that the men who preached here and started this congregation were the founders of Methodism, and that they had a congregation here since 1736. That would mean that the earliest congregants of this church literally witnessed the Battle of Bloody Marsh. It's not really often talked about, but it was the Spanish attempt to invade English holdings, and it was very, very bloody, as the name would suggest. But after Anson Jr. would pass away, he requested to be buried in the same oak coffin as his wife, so they had her exhumed so that they could be together forever. Ellen Dodge's father, David Dodge, was also a reverend in the church, and he's buried up in New York. When she passed away, she left to her husband about $250,000, not adjusted for inflation, a fund that he used solely for building this church in the foundations of the Wesley Oak and for the opening of an orphan home for boys. This couple actually never had any children, but they had about 15 orphans, and there's actually a pretty interesting monument right here to the Dodge Orphan Home. In 1890, he would marry Anna Gold, a local woman, and he had one son with her, a son named Anson. Ellen and Anson are both buried in the same churchyard, with the latter dying of an accident in 1894. This was all written about in a book called A Virginia Plantagenet, the author of which describes the descent of these families from royalty in England, Scotland, and Ireland. Ellen Gold and the Gold clan are native to this island here in Georgia and were some of the earliest inhabitants, influential people that came from the plantation class. Some, as already described, are descendants of actual royalty. And Ellen's father, a man named Horace Gold, died in a fishing accident on St. Simon's, and his father, James Gould built the lighthouse here. James was actually born in Massachusetts, the son of a sea captain, and he helped turn this island into a shipping center. His 800-acre plantation was called New St. Clair. And these are the graves of the Gould family. You can see probably a dozen headstones. And over here, you've got Dodge with his wife and the beautiful church he built in the 1880s.